Hello everyone, and welcome to my August 2018 reading wrap-up. Later in this video I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to actually film live to discuss each of the books that I read last month. I don't have a very good camera. I actually was just using my phone camera. Hopefully it'll work well enough until I get a proper camera. But the benefit of this change is that there is a much greater chance that my cat will be on the screen, so stay tuned for that. First, let's get into the stats. In August, I read 11 books. 6 were by new-to-me authors, and 5 were new-to-me books by authors I'd read before. 3 of the books had been on my owned TBR shelves, and 1 was a reread. Regarding authors, every book was written by a woman, 1 by an author of color, and 1 by a queer author. Regarding main characters, 8 books had at least 1 woman, 1 had at least 1 POC, and 3 had at least 1 queer character. The primary genre spread was 3 fantasy, 5 sci-fi, 2 contemporary, and 1 historical. 1 book was a graphic novel, and I DNF'd 1 book. My ratings fell along a wide range with 2 4.5 stars, 3 4 stars, 1 3.5 star, 3 3 stars, 1 2.5 star, and 1 1 star. The first 3 books I read in August were the last 3 of Booktubeathon, and I did a Booktubeathon wrap-up in a different video, which I'll link to below, so I won't go into detail here, but I enjoyed these 3 books overall a lot more than I did the first 4 books of Booktubeathon. Because I liked Origin so much, I decided to continue the trilogy, and I read the second book, Vitro. It wasn't nearly as good as Origin. The plot was really thin, and it took a long time to get to any type of action, and then when the action did happen, I wasn't as invested in the characters. A lot of the motivations were thin, the plot was thin, and a lot of the maneuvering of the character motivations and actions seemed to be very forced and deliberate just to get to that climax, rather than a natural progression like the first book had. Also, this book did something different from the first one in that there were 2 point-of-view characters and each chapter switched back and forth between the 2, and I think that was a factor in my disconnect from everything that happened. It was still good and it still had important themes that it tried to get across, just the execution wasn't as good as Origin. It was good enough for me to continue, so I read the 3rd and final book in the trilogy, Kalahari. This book was everything book 2 was not. It had action. It was just constant from page 5 after the very brief introductions of characters. There was danger. Each book in this series follows different people. It takes place in a totally different place in the world, but the one common thread is a biotechnology company called Corpus that does a lot of illegal research. And in the first 2 books, you are following mostly from the inside of Corpus, or someone who's closely connected to someone on the inside of Corpus. But in book 3, in Kalahari, that perspective changes to an outside perspective. You have a group of teenagers in the Kalahari desert who are not involved in Corpus at all, but they get involved just because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the danger of you as a reader having an idea of what might be going on, but them having to explore and survive in a very dangerous environment without them knowing what's going on was a really good effect. Also, I think the author actually traveled to Africa to do research for this book, and it paid off big time. The environment was great. Origin took place in the jungle, and one of the things I really liked about Origin was the sense of environment and place the rainforest around the Corpus structure had, and that also came across in Kalahari. The animals, the plants, the survival, where to get water, the things that could show up as you're sleeping, all that incorporated really, really well to add just a natural sense of danger in addition to the doings of Corpus. The romance wasn't the best thing in the world, kind of like in Origin. I didn't care as much for the romance, but it was such a small portion of the story. It wasn't the focus at all that I really enjoyed it. I did like the main characters' struggle to relate to other people having grown up in a totally different environment from them. I'm going to talk about my 2 favorite scenes or moments, and one of them was her trying to get the other teenagers in this group of people that she's trying to lead to play a game with her. She introduces a game that she grew up with, having traveled all across Africa and other places. It was to take these little pellets of some animal's poop and to put it in her mouth and spit it. And the point of the game was to see how far it could be spit. And of course, the teenagers are just absolutely disgusted. And she cleans it first, I should say. She dips it in alcohol to sanitize it first. And then she sees their faces and she points out that it's mostly grass anyway, which makes them even more sick. It was so funny and sad at the same time to see her progression in that social group, and then as they were trying to survive, them having to look to her to survive because she's the one who knows how to. It was a really good dynamic. It was compelling. Like I said, I could not put this book down. It was so action-packed. Oh, and then the second scene that really stood out to me was the main character at one point gets injured deathly badly. It's a really intense scene and she's bleeding and all this, and the guy love interest, of course, comes to her and wants to help her, but he asks for permission first before ripping apart her shirt to get to the wound. And that struck me so much, to have a scene in a book where the teenage male interest asks permission in a dire situation. That dynamic was still important enough, and you don't see that often. I was really happy to see that. I enjoyed this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's just a hair above my enjoyment of the first book, which I gave 4 stars. I also enjoyed Chocolat so much from my Booktubeathon readathon that I wanted to continue the series. It is also a trilogy. I started reading the second book, The Girl with No Shadow, and I could not finish it. This is the book that I DNF'd this month. It was completely different from book 1. Vianne is going by a different name. She's living in Paris. She's got a boyfriend who is an absolute jerk. The real Vianne, the one from book 1, would never go out with this guy. He wasn't an in-your-face jerk, but he did not get her and her family. Her youngest daughter, Rosette, doesn't speak, even though she's well past the age where she should be, and he has no patience for her and to let her grow as she wants to. He has no respect for Vianne. He's very rich, and he wants to own and control Vianne and her shop. She lets him to an extent, and it was just the most bizarre dynamic, and Nuke doesn't like him. I didn't get it. Vianne's entire internal monologue through this book is that she wants to fit in and become mainstream, which is totally different from the magic of the first book. There's a character introduced, the girl with no shadow, called Zosie. I don't know what her purpose was. She has a background kind of similar to Vianne's in that she traveled a lot, but she embraces magic and uses it in subtle ways. I don't know if she was supposed to be a good person, a bad person. She starts working in the shop and I have no idea what she was supposed to be doing. I spoiled myself for the book and just tried to read summaries of it because I couldn't get through the actual text, and I still don't really know what her purpose was. But it seems like the author, in adding more actual magic to the book, which was a lot more subtle in the first one, she actually took away what made the story and the characters so magical. There was no antagonist, there was no cohesion, there was no trajectory. Nothing happened in this second book. In the first book, you had those little victories along the way. You had Josephine escaping. You had Armand reconnecting with her grandson. I got maybe 2/3 or halfway through and nothing happened except this limboed relationship with this guy, and Vianne being all, oh, we can't use magic anymore, it's horrible, we have to fit in. It was just bizarre. In the first book, the antagonist that Vianne was running away from her entire life was the black man. In this one, it evolves into the kindly ones, which are people who present themselves as wanting to help, but they're really only doing it for their own means and not to actually help you. Vianne is terrified of the kindly ones, and she doesn't realize that her boyfriend is exactly that person. I didn't finish the book, but I don't think that realization ever happens. It was really frustrating to read and to see that so clearly, but to know that she didn't, and it wasn't even a point in the book to tackle with. I gave up after Rue appeared on the scene for the first time in this book. They were so awkward with each other. I didn't understand what their dynamic was. Vianne was absolutely terrified of seeing him. He doesn't know that his daughter even exists. They weren't them. They were totally different, flat characters. I hated it, and I did not finish it, and I do not plan to read the third book. Next, I read Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulthurst, which is a book that's been on my TBR for a while. I borrowed it from the library. I love the cover. The cover is absolutely stunning. The premise of this book is that a princess who has been raised a princess her whole life, she knows who she's betrothed to her entire life, goes to that kingdom planning for her wedding. There's some political intrigue between the kingdom and magic users. She's arriving into that kind of background tension, and she ends up falling for her betrothed sister instead. I really enjoyed the first half of this book. It promised a slow burn romance, and I was ready for it. I was waiting for that slow burn because the main character and the princess she falls in love with don't get along at first. Their relationship grows amidst that background tension. I love the way that that did grow, with them realizing that each other had strengths that they don't, and they needed to get through the issues, to get through the politics. I loved how the book focused on each of those strengths. The main character loves to do research, and she's good at it, and so she goes to the library and she gets the information that she needs that way. And then the Princess Mare is a little more of that stereotypical, oh, I don't want to be a girly princess, I don't want to be involved with the politics, but she has the skills to spy and get information. The main character, Denna, is secretly hiding her own affinity for magic. So the first half was great, getting into the world building, getting into the character relationship building, but then in the second half it seemed to switch focus a lot more to the romance aspect. That entire aspect really ramped up to the expense of all the other world building that was going on. That fell flat for me, and a lot of the other characters, like the prince and the king, just refused to listen to the sense that the princesses were making when they made points, and they urged the king and the prince to look into other things that were glaringly obvious issues that they should be looking at, and for no reason other than apparently the king and the prince were stubborn. That as the obstacle was very weak in my opinion. Overall, I did enjoy the agency that the princesses had and fought for themselves. I enjoyed the overall plot and world enough that I will be continuing the series. Next, I read the Book Jumper by Mechthild Gläser. This was translated from the German. It's a young adult novel whose premise is for every book lover out there. These two families on this island from the ages of 5 to 25 can jump into storybooks and interact with the characters, which sounds awesome, but the execution was not that great. The world building was really full of holes. I have so many questions about how jumping into the book world works. The jumpers, the characters even of the books, can interact with each other on the margins. There were a lot of great concepts in this book, just not well executed. How often do they have to go back and reenact the book's plot so that it doesn't change in all the editions of that book worldwide? How long does it take for a mistake or a change in a book's plot to affect all those other copies of the books? Why do they have to jump into the books to maintain them in the first place? Other than the one particular antagonist that happens to exist in this book, it seems like the book world takes care of itself. There was a lot that wasn't explained that really should have been, and that detracted from my enjoyment of the overall book. The pacing was often really strange. It was just like a hair off from what it should have been. The character motivations and development were very weak. There was a character with an intellectual disability who existed in the background and only came forward when he had timely, mysterious clues to give, which was the worst part of the book for me. I did read the audiobook of this version, and the narrator did the accents really well, but she had this annoying dreamlike lilt to her voice. I think she was trying to make it sound dreamlike, but it didn't fit with the book, and it was really distracting and annoying. I ended up giving this book 2.5 stars. Like I said, really great concepts. There were little nuggets in there, like living in the margins and the way they would describe jumping from book to book, but it just didn't come together in a cohesive product. Next, I read Cards of Grief by Jane Yolen. This is a sci-fi book told in interviews from an anthropological team that go to a different planet of humans who are totally different culturally from Earth humans, and they perform a study on that society. And that society is entirely focused around the art and culture of grief. I really enjoyed that anthropological perspective. I really enjoyed the mythology of the world that was explained in this book, and the stories of how and why they got to the point where they are to grieve in their culture the way that they do. I enjoyed seeing how Jane Yolen developed a society in which grief affects arts and music and every aspect that you can think of. But the arrangement of some of the interviews, especially at the beginning, was really confusing, to the point that once I got toward the end of the book, I actually had to go back and reread a chapter just to have things make more sense to me. Although I enjoyed the grief aspects of the society, there really wasn't anything else to that society. It wasn't a complete picture, and I missed those other parts of the culture and the world building. The book definitely has ideas that are worth a read, and I overall did enjoy it. I gave it 3.5 stars. The graphic novel that I read this month was The Prince and the Dressmaker by Wang. This was adorable. I loved the art style, especially at the beginning. I felt immediately immersed in this world, in the coziness with the characters, just from the way that they were drawn and their environments were drawn and colored. Gorgeous. It's historical fiction. It takes place in the 19th century. There's a 16 or so year old prince who secretly enjoys wearing dresses, and it's about that struggle, and he finds the other main character, Frances, who is a dressmaker. She secretly makes the dresses for him. I love their individual struggles. I loved how they come together and their friendship and growing romance bloom. I love the theme of just being true to yourself, and that comes across really well in this book. It wasn't anything spectacular or groundbreaking story-wise. The climax isn't anything unexpected, but it is satisfying. A lot of the climax involved a lot of public displays of secrets and making points very publicly, which personally I'm not a big fan of, probably because I'm an introvert and I don't like having lots of people's eyes on me. That translates into me not enjoying that so much in a book. I did like the twist in the final fashion show. I thought it was a really nice way for the characters who weren't as accepting initially to ultimately show that, yes, they are accepting. So again, overall, I adored this. The point was entirely about being true to yourself. That came off really strongly, and I highly recommend this book. And the last thing I read in August was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a reread for me. I've read the first 3 or 4 books in this series a couple years ago, and I've been wanting to get back to them. The first time I read this book, it was in audio, and I think the narrator just had the most lulling voice that I tuned out a lot, so I didn't remember too much of the details of this book. So I reread it, again in audio, but I made sure to pay attention this time. I liked it just as much as I remember liking it the first time. I give it 4 stars. This is a coming-of-age story for the main character, Ged, as he becomes a wizard, as he learns about the world around him. I love how seamlessly the author weaves together Ged's journey with the magnificent world building, with the magic system, and with life lessons that transcend just the magical world, that you learn through this magical world along with Ged, but they apply to any walk of life. They're done in the most poignant, beautiful ways. So many good quotes in here, so many powerful moments. It's just fantastic. Now, upon rereading it, I think it's even more impactful to me knowing what kind of character Ged becomes in the later books, to see him struggle through his youth. Knowing that really brought another dimension to my reread of this first book. I am really looking forward to continuing in my reread of this series. That's everything I read in August. I'm really looking forward to the 2 upcoming readathons that I'm going to take part in, Tome Infinity and Beyond and Contemporary-a-thon. Both are happening in September and they even overlap, so I'm hoping that I was not overly ambitious with my TBR and that I can actually get through both of these readathons unscathed. Let me know in the comments if you read any of these books and what your thoughts on them are. Thanks for joining me.